Welcome to our next build. I'm a big fan of before and after photos, so I thought I'd start again with our raw materials and see what we could turn them into. We have a stack of red oak and a wine barrel. And of course we have all the electronic components, but they're just in a cardboard box right now. Nothing exciting to look at.
Okay, so what we're gonna do, we're gonna make an arcade table, a retro arcade table. You know what that is?
No.
It's Pac-Man and Frogger and it's Dada's video games when he was a kid. And you know what we're gonna do first?
What?
Instead of making it like that,
Cut the barrel?
we're gonna cut the barrel. We're gonna cut the barrel in half.
What?
We're gonna cut the barrel in half. You gonna help me do that?
How are we gonna cut through metal?
I don't know. How are we gonna cut through metal?
If you're anything like me, then you've probably never worked with a wine barrel before either. I didn't know much of anything about a wine barrel except that it held wine. So step one, recon. I needed to take a closer look at this barrel to figure out how it was put together so I could turn around and take it apart. I picked this up a few months back at a local reclaimed wood store. I think it was about 150. They had a ton of barrels there, bourbons, wines, whiskeys. This particular one was a wine barrel. I wasn't really as concerned about what was in it. I cared more about its condition since it was going to be a key piece of the build that I was going to be doing. My helper here is one of my sons. This is the more curious and adventurous one, but much like myself, they have the focus of a squirrel, so we'll see how long he sticks around for. The next step, which we're doing here, was to remove the nails that hold the metal rings on. This is one of them right here. This barrel was absolutely filthy, and not a good filthy. A lot of rust, I'm guessing sugars, spilled wine. I don't even want to know what else was on it. So the entire thing needed a light sand to clean it up so it could be finished later. My plan was to remove the rings one or two at a time so it stayed together, sand under them, clean the rings themselves, and then put them back on and move on to the next ones. Now that I have a few of the rings off, you could kind of see under them. That darker spot towards the bottom there looks like a little wine or sugars might have leaked out, definitely some rust. I was using a really fine grit sandpaper here. I think it was a 220, really just for cleaning. I don't want to remove any of the character of the wood or the natural patina of it. Not sanding down the fresh wood, just cleaning, getting off anything that shouldn't be there. I had a couple of people ask me what kind of wine was in the barrel, so right here, T.W. Boswell. I've never heard of it, never had it, but I do feel like I need to get a bottle of it now after completing this project. The rings needed a lot of cleanup as well, and really rusty inside, so for these I used 60 grit and just kind of went around them, buffed them out. After I finish with these two rings, it's rinse and repeat. I pop them back on, take off the next set, and continue until I'm done. There were 6 rings total here, so I went through 3 cycles of this. Whole process took a good 2 to 3 hours, I'd say.
Okay, so we have our barrel. I popped all the rings off, sanded everything down underneath them, got all the rust off them and cleaned them up a little bit. Now, I'm not quite sure what to do here. So what I think we need to do is, I don't know.
As I was thinking what to do next, this is the image that kept popping into my head. So I had to stop and think through it a little bit more first.
My fear is, which not really a fear, when I cut this, everything's gonna fall apart. So I need to secure these metal rings here. Not sure what they're actually called, but I need to secure these metal ring things onto the barrel somehow. So when I cut it, everything somewhat keeps its form. So that's what we're gonna try right now. What I'm thinking is roofing nails. Thought about screws, but I think a nail with a flat head might give a slightly better look and feel. See how it works.
So here are my nails, the roofing nails. Impressive, right? I had to edit out part of the video here where I smashed my finger. I'm not sure what I was thinking when I thought I could just pound a nail right through the steel rings, but I decided to try it anyways, and you could probably imagine how that went. So after a few minutes of cursing out the barrel, I came to my senses, decided to drill some pilot holes first, and just pop the nails in, and it worked a hell of a lot better that way. I probably didn't need to put nails into every board like I did. A few in the ends in the middle would have worked just fine and held everything together, but I was also doing this for aesthetic purposes. This process took quite a bit longer than I was anticipating. It also didn't help that the barrel was rolling all over the place and spinning as I tried to drill and hammer. My finger was sore, I was hungry, it was just the perfect storm of events. In hindsight, I should have built a small standard jig to hold the barrel in place, drilled some pilot holes, went out and got some dinner, and then came back and hammered the nails in. It would have made everything so much easier, but not nearly as much fun. But then I thought about that quote. How does it go? If you don't put your blood, sweat, and tears into something, it's not worth the journey, or something like that. But at the end, this came out looking pretty sharp. I was happy with how the nails looked. I'm happy I went with nails instead of screws, and I think it turned out great. Now for the fun part, splitting it. Although I had all the pieces nailed in individually, I still didn't want anything to fall apart or bend as I cut this open. Again, I've never worked with a barrel before, so I wasn't really sure what to expect once I had one side cut open or then the other. Was it going to bend, fall to pieces? So my solution was just to tie it up with a strap that you see here. Then I needed to quickly mark the center of the barrel so I knew roughly where I was cutting, and then we were ready to go. The tool of choice was the grinder with the carbon blade. I couldn't really think of anything else to cut it with, so this is really the only option. It cut really easy. This was probably the simplest part of the entire build. The hardest part of this was just being careful not to cut or nick the wood when I cut the rings. Moment of truth, the big reveal. And that was it. Somewhat underwhelming. I gotta say, I was kind of surprised by the condition of the inside of the barrel. I don't know what I was expecting, but definitely not this. Just really nasty. I'm guessing sugars or yeast, if wine even has yeast. Not sure what it was, but I was sure I definitely needed to get rid of it. This was so thick, almost like a sand, so I started with the scraper to get the big pieces off, and then I used the same method I used on the outside, just a light sandpaper to clean it up. The top and bottom caps were all in individual pieces or planks, and I needed them solid before I could cut them, so we needed to do a glue up. And when I went to use my glue, frozen solid. Yep. I left it in the garage, and with the bitter cold we had here in Chicago, it was literally frozen solid like a rock. So I just scraped together some old glue that I had inside. Not ideal, but it worked, did the trick. You could kind of see here some sanding. This barrel was spinning all over the place. This was probably one of the more difficult parts of the build. Not so much the spinning and moving. It was just, as a whole, it was really awkward to work with. Even if I were to build a jig or a stand or something to shim up the barrel and stabilize it, it was just big and awkward to work with. And I was working on all different sides, insides, outsides, tops, bottoms. But something you could see here, even without the end supports or the caps on yet, it's still holding its shape pretty well from just the half steel ring and the nails. Before I forgot about them and sliced my hand open, I figured I should probably file down the edges of these rings since they were razor sharp from the grinder still. A few last quick cleanup items here. The top and bottom had these grooves that I had to scrape out before I could put the top and bottom caps into them so the glue would stick. Something else I completely forgot about until I flipped the barrel over, I still needed to clean the metal rings on the outside before they could be finished. You can kind of see some of the rust and stains on them. Just hit them with a quick pass of the wire brush and they were good to go. Alright, tabletop time. Now for this, I really had no formal plan either on what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted it to follow the shape of the barrel with a slight overhang on the edges, but that was about all I had. I wasn't sure yet on screen size, button placement, none of that. I did buy some extra wood here since I figured I was bound to mess up somewhere along the way and would need to redo one piece or another. But in the end, it worked out fairly well. When I was thinking through exactly what I wanted to do for the top, I knew I was going to need a large flat piece of wood so I could shape it and design it to what I needed. I could have easily used plywood for this, but I just really don't like how plywood looks. Nothing against it, just a personal preference. But I'm sure most of my hardcore woodworkers out there would agree. Solid wood always beats plywood. Once I had my end caps and tabletop glued up, I let them sit overnight, actually for a couple days. Before I came back, I took them out. Everything was perfectly straight. So it was time to clean them up, sand them down, and start some assembly. Check out that track saw right there. You know you want one. Before I start my favorite activity in woodworking, sanding, I wanted to get this top as small as I possibly could, so there's less I had to clean up. And then we sanded, and sanded some more, and some more. Last piece of the barrel assembly, I had to put the end caps back on. These are what would ultimately give the barrel its structure and support. I wasn't sure if I perfectly split the barrel. I guess I could have measured each piece, but where's the fun in that? So instead, to get a perfect fit, I put the pieces back on each side, clamped them in, and marked where the cut line would be. You can see the barrel spinning all over the place again as I try and do this. It made it easy to turn, but difficult to work with. Once I had them marked, I figured the bandsaw would be the easiest to cut them on since they were large and an awkward shape. It didn't need to be a perfect or clean cut since it would be covered anyways. So once I had them cut, I slipped them back into the end grooves that we cleaned out earlier. You can see I'm still using the frozen glue as well. Couldn't really squeeze it out of the bottle because it was so cold, but brushing it in allowed me to get it deeper into the groove anyway, so it worked out good. Once I had these glued up and in place, I secured them with some 4-inch screws on each of the sides and then flipped the barrel and put one screw on the bottom. Once it dried, this thing was rock solid. It had no give at all, so this worked perfect. One of the things I really love about woodworking is you're always learning new things and new tips and tricks. Every build I do, I always learn something new and always find something like, hey, I do that different next time. Especially now, recording myself, I'm always seeing the way I do things, and I'm like, I could do that a lot better. For this build, this part right here was it. This was I would do this different next time. I initially thought about cutting the top out on a CNC machine. This is about 36 inches max length, and I could have easily fit it in my machine. But I was really going for more of a handmade, natural look, something that mimic the barrel. Don't get me wrong, I'm really happy with how this turned out. It's everything I was going for. It was just a lot more work. This would have been a quick 15-minute cut on the CNC. Instead, it took me a couple hours. It wasn't so much the edges I wanted to cut on the CNC. I probably still would have done those by hand, but it was more so the buttonholes, the control stick, the screen and beveled edges for it. A few additional cutouts for this one. We were doing wireless phone chargers in this. But also, in my defense, I knew the components I had, but I didn't really know what was going where. I had a couple different screens I was looking at putting in here, so I didn't really know what I fully needed yet to do it on the CNC. Quick sneak peek of our technology here. I was trying to judge sizing and spacing and how everything was going to lay out. This is the monitor I ended up going with. It's a 24-inch monitor. I just wanted to see how it looked from the different angles and when we would be playing. I rigged up a little joystick here just to test out some of the buttons and the wiring to see how everything would be space-wise underneath. So when I drop the tabletop onto the barrel, everything fit correctly. We'll talk more about all these components later in the build. I just needed to temporarily lay them out here to figure out my spacing and the hole placement. Now that I picked the monitor I was going to be using, I could start measuring and cutting out the hole for it and then placing the buttons. I was in between a couple different monitors at the beginning. This one we have here is the 24-inch, and that's what I ended up going with. I figured bigger is better when gaming. So this is the underside of the table here. For the top face of the table, I knew I wanted some kind of accent frame around the monitor, so I wasn't too concerned about making perfectly smooth or straight cuts here, since they'd be concealed. But they did still need to be fairly accurate since they were going to be used primarily to position and hold the monitor in place. I've seen a lot of other people take the frames off the monitor when they install them. I decided to keep mine on. I just felt like this was an unnecessary step. I had plenty of space in here. Maybe if it was a tighter fit, I would remove it, but no need here for this build. This, of course, is the bottom of the table we're looking at. So the monitor will rest in this hole here. Once the initial hole was made, I needed to notch out a small lip for the monitor to rest on. Then to secure the monitor when I flip the table upright, my plan is to install a wood bar across the back to hold it in place. I'm ripping a few thin strips of oak. These are about 1/8 of an inch each. These are what I'm going to be using for the accent frame for the top of the table to highlight the monitor and conceal the rough cut edges from the monitor hole. This part proved to be quite a bit more difficult than I was thinking it was going to be. These pieces were so fragile and small, it was quite the task to get the precision miter cuts and assembly here. I kind of felt like I was putting one of those toy models together from when you were a kid. I knew these would be solid once they were attached to the main table, but till then they were really fragile. Another feature I wanted to add that I thought would be a really nice touch was wireless phone chargers. Most phones today work with wireless charging, at least all the ones in my house do, and that's all I really cared about. So I decided to install 2 of these on the table. I didn't want any of the wireless charge pads or stickers to go on top of the table, so I needed to make sure the wood was only about 1/2 an inch thick where these would be installed. So that meant I had to notch out 2 small pockets for these. Then it was on to the holes for the controls and buttons. You can probably start to see here why this would have been a lot easier in the CNC. Not that measuring, marking, and drilling holes is hard, it just takes a lot more time and double checking, whereas the CNC I could have precision placed these holes in the perfect spot in relation to the screen and table edges. Alright, enough of my complaining, on to our next challenge. As you can see, the colors of the wood don't quite match. A 20-year-old barrel is not going to look the same as a brand new piece of wood. They just have a different look and feel and patina to them. There's a little trick I learned that works pretty well for this. Steel wool, white vinegar, and a brown tea bag. Yep, you heard it right. You mix them all together in a jar, let it sit for a day or a few days, and you have yourself an instant wood aging formula. The longer this sits, the darker it'll become. Just paint it on. I like to let the wood sit and dry for a day or 2. Then I come back with a light sand and it's ready for sealing. You can see how the wood almost instantly darkens and ages as I paint this on, and the longer it sits, the darker it gets. You could probably get similar results with stain or other techniques, but this is just something that I've always used when working and trying to match up reclaimed wood. As the top of the table and the barrel were starting to wrap up, I had to figure out what I wanted to do for the base now. I had 2 ideas. I wanted to keep it simplistic, but this was a really heavy table and barrel. It was only getting heavier as I kept adding components onto it, so I needed something strong and stable. Plus, based on this design, I figured people would be sitting around the edges of it, so I wanted to leave some room for their legs. There's nothing I hate more when I sit down at a table and there's a giant leg or support in the way and I can't sit comfortably. So I didn't want to do that here. If you're wondering if I'm picking up my mess and saving it in a little plastic baggie, you're not seeing things. If you don't do this, I recommend everyone save some wood dust from various woods you work with. It comes in really handy for filling small gaps or seams, cracks, holes. This was a really clean and fine pile of dust for the red oak, so I wanted to restock my supply of it. I landed on somewhat of a triangle pyramid type shape for the legs, then they would have a runner that goes between them for added support. I was planning to install these on a slight angle, leaning inward somewhat to follow the curve of the barrel. I did a quick glue up of these and then left them to dry for a day. Because of the way this was going to be assembled and all the additional electronic components going into it, I decided it was going to be a lot easier to seal and finish each of the different components of the table before I assembled them. Right here I'm giving the inside of the barrel a quick coat of triple thick poly. This is where I jumped into a rapid fire movement in the shop. I was jumping from piece to piece as I finished and waited for it to dry. Same thing with the tabletop here. I needed to fully finish it before I could start assembly. So you could see the aging solution I put on it, giving it a light sand. I was going to leave it a bit darker, but then I decided I wanted this piece a bit lighter because I was going to engrave some logos and stuff on top and I wanted to easily be able to see them. After sanding, I went with an in-between stain color, not super dark, but not remotely light. I was really happy overall with the stain, the way the color came out. You can see it's definitely darker. I'll try and find a piece for comparison, but if I were to take a piece of natural oak and the piece treated with the aging, complete difference. Onto the legs. Right now, these probably just look like two giant slabs of wood, and to be fair, they are. I purposely wanted these to be thick, and they are heavy. I didn't think oak weighed this much. I heard somewhere in another video that I watched that oak weighs about 25% more than walnut or maple. Not sure how true that is, but I could tell you this table was heavy. It was probably like half the size of the last build I did, the foosball table. It easily felt twice as heavy as that. But back to the legs. I let these dry for a few hours or days. It was all a blur at this point. First thing I did was to give them a rough sand so I could get a straight cut on them. Then it was time to cut. I was initially going to cut them on a table saw, use the miter gauge to get the right angle, but it was just an awkward fit and shape of them, plus they were so thick. So I figured the bandsaw was the next best bet, and I could just give the edges a quick pass with the hand planer and straighten them up after I was done. Then for the top and bottom, I did end up taking them through the table saw just to make sure they were the same height. If you remember my initial plan for the legs, they were placed about 6 inches in and angled slightly inward on the barrel. To get the perfect fit, I needed these to follow the shape of the barrel perfectly, and I also needed to add a slight angle onto them since they would be tilted. Since the barrel swells as we move closer to the center, and these were each going to be placed about 6 inches from the end, I needed to account for the extra size, so I used my tape trick to get the extra buffer I needed here. I also wasn't entirely sure on the final height of the table yet, so I made my initial curved cut as close to the top of each of the legs as I could to give me the maximum height. Then I could come back later and cut these down if I needed to. As it turns out, I did end up cutting these down about 5 inches towards the end of this just for a more comfortable playing height. You can see right there we have a near perfect fit. So now that we're done with the cuts, I'm going to take these over to the spindle sander and just clean up the edges a little bit. Again, you're not really going to see this part, and I think I might put some kind of padding or some kind of rubber inside of here just to allow the wood to expand and contract a little bit, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. This piece I'm cutting here is going to become the center beam that'll go between the two legs for added support. You can see here as well, it's cut at a slight angle to follow the angle of the legs and the angle of the legs are attached to the barrel with. I wasn't sure how I was going to attach this yet, but I figured we'd be finding that out shortly. And then with all the pieces in here, I wanted to give it a quick sand because I had to really kind of finish everything before I put it together the way this build was going to work out. As I was thinking through how I wanted to attach the 3 pieces for the legs, I decided to jump back to the barrel. Earlier, I already stained the wood of the barrel and put a single coat of poly on it to semi-protect the wood and stain. Now I needed to paint the metal rings. I used some smaller painter's tape to cut in really close around the rings and then used some thicker masking tape to fill in the rest of the gaps.
So, I was all excited, just taped up this whole barrel, ready to paint the rails. I have no paint. So I think I'm going to go run a quick run to Home Depot.
I never did make it to Home Depot that night. I didn't realize it was already close to 10 o'clock, so I decided just to pick up the paint on the way home from work the next day and spray it then. It took all of about 30 seconds to spray all the rings. I gave them 2 coats each. I let them dry for a day in between before pulling all the masking tape off. Next, I'll direct your attention to my shop apron. Check it out as I walk around. Nothing but the best for me. Before starting to assemble, I wanted to get a quick coat of poly over everything, mainly to protect it. Everything about this build had an awkward shape and was difficult to work with. I figured I'd be twisting, spinning this, scraping it up quite a bit, plus I still had quite a few holes I needed to make, so I wanted to lock out any new dust I might be making. So it was poly and cleanup time now before I started final assembly. I spent the next 10 or 15 minutes walking around and checking everything out, making sure there were no major scuffs or scrapes, nothing that couldn't be covered up later. So once I assembled it, everything was going to get a lot more difficult to move.
Okay, before we call it a night, I wanted to give a quick update what we did here. Behind me here, I have all our different components, the legs on each side, the support for them way back there, screen bezel in the center, our hardware mount, our top, and of course the star of the show, the barrel. What I did tonight, I threw a quick coat of poly over everything. A couple of reasons. I wanted to mainly protect it. In Chicago here, we're having some wild weather right now where we're up in the 70s and back down in the 40s, rain, humidity, so I wanted to prevent any warping, so I wanted to get all the wood sealed. But another reason, tomorrow I'm hoping to assemble everything, and I want to protect it as I do. I don't want to get any scuffs and scrapes. So this is not my final coat by any means, but I just want to more or less protect the wood until it's assembled and fully finished.
Okay, I have my plan for the legs and how to assemble them. Sit back and watch. This is quite the process. The whole time I kept thinking there has to be a way. I decided to use dowels for the main attachment piece to help with alignment, the poor man's domino. Pocket screws for the top and bottom of each of the ends to give some added strength, and then some wood glue. If I were to do this again, I would have went mortise and tendon joints, but I already had all my pieces finished and I didn't want to scrape them running them through a router table or a table saw to get my notches. But in the end, this worked out just fine. The base is, rock solid again. I don't have any concerns about structure of it. Probably just not the best technique I could have used. Now my process here was really easy for the first leg. Then it got exponentially harder once I had the first side done and attached. It probably would have been a lot easier to mark everything, stand it up, and build this in an upright position. But again, I was on a mission here. I started this, I was committed at this point. Just look at that upper body strength. I know this was up in the workbench right now, but I could already tell here that this was going to be way too high. I wasn't quite ready to cut it down yet, but I knew I was going to have to at some point. Last finishing piece for the top of the table, if you remember those wireless phone chargers I put in, I thought it would look best to laser engrave, which is basically burning, a small little lightning bolt over where each of the chargers were so we could easily locate them later. I don't have a close-up here, but I'll get a zoomed-in picture of these later on, and they came out really good. If you watch my previous video, you probably say, hey, that foosball table looks familiar. Yes, that is the one from our last build, and it is still standing. Typically, I wouldn't build in my basement, but because of how heavy this piece was already and all the additional components I was going to put into it, I decided it was best to finish it down in the basement where it would be staying. It was somewhere around here where I decided this needed to be lowered. Unfortunately, this was just a quick cut I did, and I didn't have a chance to record it. But it was the same process as earlier. I just laid this on its side, I used the template I had earlier, and used the jigsaw to cut it out. As you can see, my helper returned for a short time. I said carefully open the boxes in case they don't work, we'll need to return them. Luckily, everything worked fine. As you probably guessed, these are the wireless phone chargers. They mount on the underside of the table, and you just set your phone over them on top of the table, and it charges. These came with the mounts you see here, and I just secured them to the bottom in a little pockets I notched out for them earlier. Last few pieces of construction you see here before we assemble all the electronic components. I was putting a few holes in top here. These are what are going to help align the top frame of the table. You also see inside of the table on the sides the larger holes. A few of these are for speakers, and then a few of them I wanted to leave some air vents. I don't think anything's going to get really hot in here, but I wanted to make sure I had ventilation just in case. Okay, we're at the point now where we're ready to start installing all the arcade components. So I'm not going to do a deep instructional dive here on how to do what, because I'm not fully sure yet, but I wanted to show some of the core components here. So first we have the power supply. Nothing fancy, some inputs, some outputs. Here's the power input, so power goes in somewhere up here, I'm guessing. Power comes out down here to the main arcade board. We of course have the main arcade board. This is a JAMMA board. JAMMA, J-A-M-M-A, whatever your flavor is. This is a 60-in-1 arcade board, VGA out, audio out. It does have power here, but I think it's going to be powered through the main input here. The main wiring for it, this is the wiring harness, I guess.
looks innocent in the package here, but when you open this thing up, I have one open here. This consists of about 6 feet of wiring, all in a giant ball of spaghetti here. But you can see on the sides here, there's 2 sides to this. There's the part side and the solder side. Everything's somewhat labeled. Player 1 buttons, speakers, power, joystick, up, down, setup, coin. So this is our main wiring diagram. We of course have the buttons and the joysticks. Ain't anything fancy here, just basic button and joystick. They attach little spin nuts that come out and off. And the main switches are buttons for the button. There's a little click button right there. You see 2 pins here. I'm guessing power and ground. I haven't got that far yet. And these attach into the bottom of the button and the joystick somehow. What else? Oh, little baby speakers here. These are about 2-inch speakers. I'm just gonna mount these on the side for some basic sound. So let's see how those work. And that's about all. So again, I'm gonna do a separate video for the install of this for anyone that's interested, but here I'm just gonna kind of fast forward to where we have the install complete.
I initially started with the speakers mounted on each of the sides of the barrel. I ended up having to move these later on down the road. What happened is when I put the tabletop on, the joysticks were also right in the center, and when I dropped it in, they were bumping into the top of the speaker. So I just moved the speakers to the right and left vent holes, and that was it. These are the vent covers I got, just a basic cover, nothing fancy. I didn't throw a case fan in. I don't think I'll need one. I don't think any components in here throw too much heat. I just wanted to leave a couple holes on each side to get a little bit of airflow passing through. Okay, this part of the build is what I called the calm before the storm. The button and joystick install. This was the easy and fun part that I kind of been looking forward to, but I knew what was coming right after it, all the wiring. So took a minute to enjoy the quiet and peace here before chaos unfolded. Before we get into the mess of wiring, let's talk about buttons and joysticks. There are a ton of options out there. Different styles, different colors, different brands, and I bought quite a few of them. Most of them probably. And then I left for vacation, forgot all about them, and it was too late to return them. So now I'm the proud owner of a bunch of crappy buttons and joysticks. When I was looking to buy buttons and joysticks, I really didn't know much of anything about arcades or buttons, and I still don't know that much, but what I have learned, I could tell you, is you get what you pay for, like most things in life. The cheap ones definitely felt cheap, and I have no doubt they'll break fairly quickly. The more expensive ones definitely felt more solid. I think those will hold up a little bit longer. For this particular build, I wasn't going for anything flashy. I didn't want light up buttons or exotic colors. I'm a simple guy with a less is more philosophy. I wasn't planning to install 8 buttons on each side and a flight simulator joystick. This machine was really made to play Pac-Man and Frogger, a basic joystick and button set. That's all I needed for this. The joysticks I used were really good quality and really nice, but they were a bit of a pain to put in. I literally had to disassemble the whole thing and then put it in one piece at a time. There were different grommets, springs, caps, ton of screws. Last component I had to install before starting the wiring were the actual switches. These are the little gray boxes here with the 2 pins you see. These are what actually wire up into the game board and make the clicks when you push the button. Next, before starting the wiring, I labeled everything so I could easily look and know what was going where before I unraveled this spaghetti ball of wires here. While this definitely wasn't my favorite part of the build, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Wire management was probably my biggest challenge, keeping everything neat and organized so I could still move components around until I had everything in its final place. Okay, buttons and controls are wired up now. Time to install the power supply and the main arcade board. A few other items here as well. You can see the speaker I moved to the side. I opted to go with just one instead of 2 of them like I had before. Also towards the bottom is a setup button. This isn't an off location since it's really only used for the initial setup and configuration. I don't want anyone to accidentally bump into it. Any of my fellow IT guys out there will probably recognize these screws I used here. These are just standard PC motherboard mounting screws. I didn't want the arcade board sitting directly on the wood in case it got hot, and I definitely didn't want it just flying around loosely in there, so this was my method to secure it. I drilled a couple pilot holes, put some glue on the tip of these screws, and just pushed them in there. Once they dried, I was able to secure the board to them, and it wasn't going anywhere. Now it was time to attach the power supply. You could see I have the main power switch coming into the bottom of the power supply already, and there were 3 wires for the arcade board that go various locations on top of the power supply. Again, I'll do a deep dive wiring video later, but for this video, this is what it looks like. And that was about it. This is where I kind of wrapped up my electronic hookup. You can see I got all my wires neatly tied so I could lift the lid off if I need to get in there for any kind of maintenance. Get a quick glimpse of the support I used to hold the monitor in place as well. I used some threaded inserts and a couple 2-inch bolts, this piece of wood across the back. For putting the lid on, I didn't want anything that permanently attached it in case I needed to get back in here, so you can see the pegs I had there, the dowels I used. Just drop the lid on and make sure it slid in there, and that was all.
What do you think? I'm curious to hear your thoughts, what you like, what you don't like, what you do differently. Overall, I'm really happy with it. But then again, I like all the projects I make, so my vote doesn't really count. I am going to be building a few more of these different variations. I've had a few requests for more of a portable tabletop one and a wall mount one, so I'm going to give those a try over the coming weeks or months. I could share some quick numbers with you on this build. Total build time was in the 3 to 4 week range. I did take a small vacation in the middle, so that delayed it a bit, but total cost came in right around $775. I'm not quite sure on the cost numbers here because I bought a lot of stuff before I left for vacation, and I bought a lot of material too. So, but the barrel was $175. Oak, I bought a ton of extra oak for other projects, but what I consumed for this one, I figure around $200. Electronics, the monitor, the arcade board, the buttons, the joysticks, I figure around $300, give or take. And then shop consumables, the stain, the poly, the nails, the sandpaper, I figure another 100. So all in cost, between $700 and $800. I had a couple people asking me what's up next. I actually have one more piece for this that I do want to build. When I bought the barrel, I bought a bunch of extra staves. Those are the wood pieces that make up the barrel. My plan is to make 2 stools for this so we could kind of a matching set to go with, so we're not using folding chairs for it. So hoping to start that shortly, and that should be a fairly quick build. So I'll get that video up as soon as we have it. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed, and check back soon. I have some really interesting upcoming projects I want to give a try. So until next time.